The storm was killing her children, until a silent Comanche stepped through the snow and opened his hand. He didn't speak. He just pointed to the sled. What happened next will break every rule you thought you knew. But first, let's go back to the beginning. In the wind-scoured plains of northern Texas, 1873, winter didn't fall so much as it descended, like judgment. It came in slow at first, a cold draft under the floorboards, a frost rim around the tin basin. But by January, it had taken hold of everything. Soil turned to stone, creeks to silence, and breath into vapor that barely cleared the lips before freezing. It was in that silence that Margaret Whitfield moved like a ghost through her own home, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare rug Samuel had once bartered for with a sack of potatoes. Her husband had been buried 4 months beneath a crooked wooden cross she fashioned herself from the broken legs of their kitchen table. She'd used her wedding veil to wrap his Bible, now stashed in a drawer she hadn't opened since. The townsfolk of Dunning Ridge hadn't offered to help. They'd sent a basket of biscuits, stale before they arrived, and then gone back to whispering behind hymnals. She ought to go back east. Widowed and stuck with 2 young'uns? That's no life. But Margaret stayed, not because of pride, though she had plenty of that, but because of promise. Before Samuel coughed himself into silence, she'd pressed his hand and told him she'd keep the children warm, fed, and alive. Alive most of all. Ethan and Abigail were 6, mirror images of their father. Wide eyes too old for their years, hair like wind-swept hay. They rarely cried. Not because they were brave, but because they had learned not to waste tears on things that wouldn't change. The cabin leaned slightly west now, its bones warped by wind and grief. The roof leaked in 2 corners, and the hearth had gone cold a week ago. She'd used the last of the kindling 3 nights back, broken the old stool to feed the flames. Yesterday it had been the broom handle. Tonight there was nothing left to burn but the wooden cradle, and Margaret had stared at it a long while before shaking her head no. Instead, she bundled her children under every quilt she'd ever stitched. The last one, the one made from Samuel's old shirts, she laid over their feet. Then she sat beside them and told the story of the fox and the crow, her voice hoarse, dry, her fingers stiff from the cold. But her words weren't for them anymore. They were for herself. Some fragile, trembling attempt to keep death away a little longer. And then, at the edge of sleep and frost, something shifted. A shadow, sharp and slow, moved across the window pane. Not the wind, not the storm. Something human. He did not knock. He didn't have to. The wind had quieted when he came, unnaturally, as if the storm itself recoiled from him. Margaret saw him through the frost-blurred glass, a shape cut against the storm like an ancient carving, tall and still, a figure carved from darkness and snow. His coat was stitched from animal hide, heavy with ice, the fur haloed in white. His hair, thick, black, braided in long rows, whipped behind him like a banner. His face was unreadable, carved in calm lines, eyes narrowed not with cruelty but focus. For one suspended moment, Margaret thought he was death himself, come on foot instead of wings. But then he stepped forward and knelt by the doorframe, slowly, deliberately, and looked straight at her, not through her, not around her, but into her. And in that quiet stare was no threat, only burden. He said nothing at first. Instead, he nodded toward the twins, who lay blue-lipped and breathless beneath the last of the quilts, then pointed to the sled lashed with hides and rope behind him. There was no warmth in his gesture, but there was urgency. Margaret's heart pounded against every tale she'd ever been told. Her father had warned her, "If the Comanche come, you run. If you can't run, you pray." But she'd already prayed, and her children were dying. So she wrapped Ethan, then Abigail, and handed them to him, each as fragile as a thought slipping into sleep. The ride was brutal. Wind slashed through her skirts, and the sky disappeared behind a curtain of white so thick it swallowed the moon. Eli didn't speak. His shoulders were rigid, and his breath came slow, like a man used to silence. He moved through the snow like he belonged to it. The shelter was hidden, half buried in a slope beneath tall pines. Smoke drifted upward in a thin line, nearly invisible. Inside it was small but sacred, animal skins lining the walls, an oil lamp flickering on a low stone, and the smell of pine sap and rabbit fat. Eli set the children down, wrapped them in buffalo hide, and ladled broth from a clay pot without ceremony. Margaret sat across from him, her hands raw and red, stitching where she could feel nothing. The fire warmed her skin, but not the ache behind her ribs. When she finally found the voice to ask why, he looked up from the flames, not at her, but through time. "I saw the smoke," he said, "and I remembered my mother's voice, soft, like wind through tall grass. I didn't want to hear it in the storm." She didn't ask again. Some griefs weren't meant to be named. Instead, they sat in silence, two people carved out by loss, sharing warmth in a world that had no place for either of them. By spring, the snow had melted into the roots of the trees, and the land began to breathe again. It was not a sudden rebirth, but a slow loosening of winter's grip, like grief thawing in the body. Beneath Eli's lean-to, Margaret found work for her hands and silence for her thoughts. She mended what could be mended, seams in fur cloaks, tears in canvas, the wooden latch on the storage chest. She lined the shelter's walls with cloth scraps salvaged from her old cabin, bits of Samuel's shirts, Ethan's outgrown trousers, her wedding dress now cut into squares and repurposed for warmth. Each stitch was deliberate, her fingers moving with the memory of what had been and the quiet faith in what still could be. The twins laughed more now. Eli taught them to read footprints like stories, how to find mint near the riverbed, how to listen for the silence that meant a deer was near. At night, they lay curled under hides, whispering about the stars. Margaret listened to their voices and sewed long after dark by lamplight, her needle slipping through cloth like a whisper through the hush of the woods. But peace, however earned, was not without price. When she walked into Dunning Ridge, heads turned, not with curiosity, but condemnation. The silence of the townsfolk was louder than insults. Mrs. Clary, the preacher's wife, met her gaze with narrowed eyes and turned her back deliberately. Others followed suit. Margaret's presence, straight-backed, plain-dressed, carrying a sack of flour, was treated like a sin. She heard the whispers. "Took up with a heathen. Doesn't even wear black anymore." But Margaret didn't break. She straightened her shoulders, paid her coin, and left without raising her voice. Pride didn't need to shout. The rock came 2 nights later. It shattered the window with a sharp cry of broken glass, waking the children. No name was carved in the stone, but the message was etched deep. She swept it up without a word. When Eli returned from the woods, his rifle slung over his shoulder, he found her kneeling in the corner, stitching the torn leather of his saddlebag. Her hands shook, but she kept sewing. He crouched beside her and picked up a shard of glass. Its edge caught the firelight, trembling. "If they throw stones," he said, voice low, "they have nothing left to offer." Margaret stared at the needle in her hand, at the blood blooming on her fingertip. "They say I've shamed Samuel." Eli placed his hand over hers, not firm, not claiming, just steady. "You kept your children alive. That's honor, not shame." And for a long moment, they sat like that, fingers threaded, grief layered with something new. Not desire, not yet, but something firmer, something earned. The wedding was no more than a breath between seasons, a murmur of vows beneath the pale blossoms of a cottonwood tree that had dared to bloom before its time. No preacher, no ribbons, no town gossip to sully the moment, just the scent of thawed earth, 2 children with flowers in their hands, and a circle of river stones Eli had placed the night before. The wind stirred Margaret's hair and lifted the hem of her worn calico dress, and though she said nothing, her fingers trembled slightly as she took Eli's hand. It was not a union born of fire or longing, but of shelter. 2 souls who had weathered enough to know that peace was not found in promises, but in presence. When Ethan looked up, blinking against the sunlight, and asked if they were a real family now, Eli bent to meet his eyes. "A family," he said, "is who stays when the storm comes." They did not rebuild the cabin on the hill. Some things, once broken, belonged to the past. Instead, they carved a home into the landscape beside the hollow. Wood, hide, and pine, stitched together with labor and quiet joy. It was a house of slow mornings and warm hearths, of hand-me-down laughter and fresh pies cooling on windowsills. Margaret no longer sewed in silence. She sang while she worked, humming melodies her mother once sang, melodies she hadn't remembered until now. Children from the town began to wander down the ridge, lured by the smell of berries and cinnamon. They sat on her porch and listened to her stories, their faces sticky with crust and sugar. One gray-haired woman, the same who once looked past Margaret in the market, now watched her with quiet awe. "She walks like her mother did," the woman whispered once, not knowing Margaret heard. "Strong, proud, like she's finally come home." When the plains turned gold with the full bloom of spring, Eli led Margaret to the ridge. From there, the horizon was endless, creases of earth stitched together by sun and sky, the town behind them, the future before. Margaret stood with her palms open, breathing in the wide silence. "You saved me," she said softly. Eli, ever still, shook his head. "You saved yourself. I only showed you the way back." That night, after the fire had dimmed and the children slept tangled in blankets, Margaret unfolded the final quilt. She ran her hand across each patch, pieces of loss, of love, of beginning. The coat from the storm, Samuel's curtain, Eli's torn sash, all of it sewn into a single truth. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat by the hearth, not forgotten, not broken, not ashamed. Home.